We have widened our circle, and it's very pleasant for me to welcome two new experts, Professors Paul Cliteur and Professor Herman Philipse. And you've been watching the entire afternoon. You've heard expert witnesses. You have heard pleas, pro and con. Can I have your opinion? Can you? Yes, please.
Yeah. Let me start by telling you this. I'm a humanist, a free thinker, a secularist, a liberal, an atheist, and an agnostic.
But not an Amma-Arts.
All at the same time. So who am I to say something about the lifting of the ban on Spinoza? And yet, having listened to all the excellent commentaries today, I have developed a certain vision, and I have 3 reasons to be in favor of a lifting of the ban. I side, of course, with Nathan Lopes Cardozo in many things that he has said. So the lifting of the ban is also an ideal for me. But his reasons for doing so appear to me quite incoherent. In a certain sense, I'm in full agreement with, I suppose, with the chief rabbi. He's not there anymore, so I cannot verify this exactly. But what the previous speaker has said, I don't know what it is, but it's not Judaism. It's the first thing that comes to mind is postmodernism or a kind of extreme relativism, but it's not Judaism. And that's interesting, because then the next question is, what do you do within a religious community when somebody voices ideas which are definitely not the mainstream of the community? To my mind, the previous speaker was heretical. It was, from an Orthodox perspective, blasphemous, and it was apostasy. But still, if I would ask you now, well, what to do with the man? Let's excommunicate him. There would not be many fingers in support, I think, of that idea. And that's interesting, because that testifies to the fact that nowadays we think that the excommunication of Spinoza was wrong. It was clearly wrong. It was in contradiction with freedom of thought, with freedom of expression, with freedom of religion, which includes also the ability to voice heretical ideas. And I think that has to be said. And there are all kinds of other ways to deal with someone who has unorthodox ideas within a community. You do not have to say, don't eat with the man. Do not communicate with him. Let's expel him from the community. You can simply say, well, it's not the orthodoxy, it's not the mainstream in the community, but still we can see him as a member of the community. And I think that had to be done with Spinoza. Now, if you allow me, one final observation with regard to the actual significance of the ban. What surprised me a little bit, that there was a lot of contextualizing, historical talk, understanding for what had happened a long time ago, but there was a certain silence. And if I have a good opinion on the sense of the meeting, there was also a little bit of unease when the ban was read aloud now. A few 10 minutes or a quarter of an hour ago. There was some feeling also in this audience that this was not the right way to deal with someone with heretical ideas. And that's also not without practical significance, because it's also interesting to contextualize the ban a little bit and to compare the ban on Spinoza with similar occasions within other religions. In 1570, the Pope in Rome, Pope Pius V, issued a bull, Regnans in excelsis, excommunicating Queen Elizabeth of England. And the practical significance of that excommunication was not only that Queen Elizabeth could not call herself a good Catholic, But the consequence was also physical violence. In a certain sense, it was a covert incitement to physical violence. The Catholics in England saw it as their primary duty to kill the Queen, to remove her from the throne, and that is also something that is connected to a ban. Not so manifestly in the case of Spinoza, but in a lot of cases it is. Especially also within the context of radical Islam. In 1989, Ayatollah Khomeini, he in a certain sense excommunicated Salman Rushdie, and he tried to incite all the sincere believers to kill the blasphemer, to kill the apostate within the religious community. And that's mostly a context that's connected to a ban. And I think it would be a very good idea when the Amsterdam Jewish community would learn from that, would contextualize the ban in this contemporary context of religious violence, and they would lift the ban. That would be a very good idea. Thank you.
Professor Philipse.
We are short of time, so I will try to be very, very brief on this and just defend a few theses. First of all, we are here to honor Spinoza. I think that we should admire his courage to think freely at a time that it was more difficult to do that than it is now. So I think we are here to honor Spinoza. That's why I'm here. Not because I'm a Spinoza specialist, and of course, if Spinoza didn't know enough of the Talmud, we might criticize him, but he was a great philosopher in the context of the 17th century. Of course, philosophy has advanced since then enormously. So that's my first observation. The second is that, of course, the Jewish community should decide themselves whether they want to, if they can legally, whether they can want to lift the ban or not. I'm an external person. I will not patronize the Jewish community. They should decide. I have listened with great interest to all the different positions here, but I have an advice to everyone. So if there are communities that think that they should excommunicate someone because that person thinks freely and tries to discover truth, then my advice would be never become member of such a community. And of course, most religious communities maybe are like that. Of course, Lopes Cardozo claimed that the Jewish community is an exception. I hope that's true. I'm not an expert. I can't judge here. But I would say, so the community has to decide. We have freedom of religion. We have also freedom of membership. If they want to expel a member, it's up to them, not up to me as an outsider. I would think that's completely wrong to give such an advice.
But can I very briefly ask you, Professor Cliteur was very clear. He condemned the ban, in a sense, in its wording, in its effects. Do you think whether the ban was morally defensible?
I think the ban should be placed back in the 17th century. So in order to give a moral judgment of the ban, we should take all the contexts into account. And let me just compare the ban of Spinoza. So he was excommunicated. The text of the ban might shock us deeply. Surely it shocks me. But let me compare the ban of Spinoza with other punishments for people who were not properly religious according to certain churches. My favorite example here is the Chevalier de la Barre, who in 1765, as a young man, he was 19, said that he didn't really believe in the Christian religion, and he refused to kneel down for a Catholic procession. Also, he was accused of harming a statue on a bridge, which turned out to be not true. Now, in France at the time, there was no separation between church and state, and the court issue against him went up to the highest courts in France, and he got the following punishment. His tongue was torn out, his hands were cut off, and then he was burned alive. Now, if I compare that punishment in 1766 with the punishment of Spinoza in the 17th century in the Netherlands, I would say the Jewish community at the time was much more humane than lots of other religious community were even a century later.
If you compare the excommunication of Spinoza with the way Adrian Kurbach was treated here in the Dutch Republic, then the Portuguese community appears as a very, very mild and liberal congregation. But I gave here a very brief historical description about the situation in Amsterdam and the Western Sephardic diaspora without referring to my own views. I am a cultural Jew, I am a secular Jew, I identify myself with Jewish culture, with Jewish past. There are many things in Jewish tradition that I find very interesting and are part of myself. And there are other things in Jewish tradition that I don't like. And that's not a problem for a modern secular Jew like me. Now, I know that in this audience, if I would say that we should leave the audience, I will get a big applause. So I, the secular Jew, must say that Rabbi Toledano has full right. There is no way to lift the cherem. The cherem can be lifted only according to the same tradition that it was declared. So that means by the halakha. And the halakha doesn't offer any possibility to lift the cherem. For secular people, secular Jews like me, it would be really offensive to say that Spinoza needs a lifting of the cherem. For us, Spinoza is an icon, a hero. He's part of our culture, not only because we are not modern Jews, because we are liberal, because we are for democracy, and because we admire the way Spinoza expressed himself under the limitations of a corporative system. So I must say I cannot understand the need to leave the cherem. Who needs to leave the cherem? Spinoza? If Spinoza would be here, he would say, for God's sake, yes? For God's sake, who needs all this nonsense? Yes?
You mean for nature's sake?
Now I will. Let me now bring another historical fact from a rabbi of the beginning of the 18th century, a man called David Núñez Torres. He was an Orthodox rabbi. He was a kind of troublemaker. He was the best student of Chacham Sas Portas, the greatest halachic authority in the Portuguese community of 17th century Amsterdam. And David Núñez Torres was born in Amsterdam, raised in Amsterdam. He didn't get the position that he expected in the community and went to The Hague. And then he was a rabbi in the first congregation and the rabbi of the second congregation, and a very Orthodox rabbi. Now, the man had about 2,200 books, non-Jewish books. We don't know what was his halachic library, but you can expect that it was also a very rich halachic library. Now, this man, David Núñez Torres, had in his library a copy of the edition of the Tractatus from the first edition of 1670. He had the Opera Postuma of Spinoza from 1677. He had also the clandestine translation into French of La Clé d'Histoire. He had also the Dutch translation, the Rechtszinnige Theologie, and he had about 20 books about Spinoza, which reflect more or less the most important part of the reception of Spinoza of the first two generations. And the last book that he bought about Spinoza appeared in 1727. He passed away in 1728. That means that David Núñez Torres was interested in Spinoza almost all his life and read Spinoza and even wrote an article that was published posthumously comparing between the Ein Sof of Hayun and Spinoza's idea of God. So, going back to another rabbi who would probably not get here an applause, that was the chief rabbi of Israel, Herzog, who in the 1950s, when Ben-Gurion asked what you are asking here, the Sherem should be lifted, he said, there is no way to do it, because you can do what you want. If you want that other Orthodox communities should respect the decision, you have to behave according to the halakha and according to what is expected in Orthodox communities. So what Rabbi Herzog said, the cherem cannot be lifted, but there is no prohibition to read Spinoza because he finds the solution in the halakha. The last sentence of the cherem that forbids the reading of Spinoza's work is not under cherem. So a Jew can read Spinoza and he will not be punished for that, and he will not be put on cherem on that. So I ask you, in respect for Spinoza, leave this issue to history. What we can do now is, of course, explain what happened. We can even condemn what happened. But to leave the cherem, that means play with the orthodoxy, but behaving against the rules for the orthodoxy. That is something which is a contradiction.
There are many people who want to put forward something now, but I give the precedence to Paul Cliteur.
Yeah, thank you, Mrs. Chairman. Let me try to give an answer to the question of the previous speaker. What would be a reason, apart from all the theological niceties, to lift the ban? I think that we have to take into consideration that freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom of religion is at this very moment in great jeopardy. In the beginning of this year, in January 2015, two brothers, the Kouachi brothers, they stormed into the headquarters of Charlie Hebdo, killed the people present there, simply because they thought that they had the right to do so according to their religious convictions. And there are many examples that we can give at this very moment where radical Islam attacks freedom of speech as a principle. And now I know Herman Philipse was perfectly right that the punishments meted out by the Catholic Church were much more severe than what happened with Spinoza. Also partly, I think, because the Jewish community in those times simply did not have the power to go further than that. But the whole idea that people using their freedom of expression have to be punished by getting them out of the community, don't communicate with them, curse them, those kind of things, that's really a very bad idea, even if that does not always result in clear killing.
Let me disagree with this. So I would say that freedom of religion implies that if you want to found a religious community that as a criterion for membership has stated that you have to accept certain religious ideas, that is also a right of freedom in our society. Now, I would recommend be never a member of such a community because you lose your freedom of mind. But we have freedom of religion, so these communities have the right to exist. And we should not compare these communities with other religious communities that kill outsiders for all kinds of other reasons. I think we should not be drawn into the comparison with terrorists who claim that they are Islam somehow. That's not the topic of this evening.
It is.
We will discuss that later, but before we do,
There was an attempt to kill Spinoza as well, was it not? Directly after the excommunication. No?
So I would actually like to, before I say another word, let me just say for the record, I am against punishing people for their ideas and expression of ideas. However, I think we need a little nuance when we say that the excommunication of Spinoza was wrong. Yes, it was wrong from a moral perspective. Yes, it was wrong because it's contrary to some principles that we hold very dear: freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and freedom of thought. It was also probably wrong from a social and political perspective. However, the notion that something is wrong, I think, needs to be always put in context. And so what the question really should be, and I don't have an answer to this, but and as a philosopher, I don't give answers, I just give questions. Yeah, very Jewish too. So the question is, what do we mean by wrong when we say it was wrong? And I think the important way of addressing that question is, was it in the best interest of the community? Did it further the community's ends? I don't know if there's a clear answer to that, but I think when we ask whether it was wrong to excommunicate Spinoza, that's the more interesting question. We know it was morally wrong. The question, was it wrong from the perspective of the Jewish community? Spinoza knew the rules of the game, and the people who imposed the cherem were enforcing the rules of the game.
That is a very clear statement. Chacham Toledano has been very patient, but the floor is now his. Maybe you can stand up, please. Thank you.
Microphone, yeah.
And switch the mic on. Maybe Ronit, you can help? It's working. Thank you.
Thank you. Where do I stand?
This is fine.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I have no wish to repeat what I have said. As you can see for yourself, ladies and gentlemen, nowadays, we don't put anyone in a cherem. If we are going to put people in a cherem, I think we will put 3/4 of the Jewish people in a cherem. So that you can see for yourself, we don't do it anymore. But as you have heard from me, and in fact from Professor Kaplan, you have heard yourself that at that time, it was absolutely important that a cherem should be put on Spinoza. And I don't agree, with all due respect, with Professor Paul Cliteur. Yes. When you gave the comparison with Rushdie, remember, Ayatollah Khomeini brought a fatwa to kill. We don't kill. We just put a person in a ban.
I told that.
Right. So I think the comparison was absolutely wrong.
No.
As to you, my dear colleague and friend, Rabbi Cardozo, and you are my colleague and friend, as a matter of fact, first of all, you put a lot of anger on Maimonides. Now, I have been studying, you have been studying since a boy, you have been studying Spinoza, I have been studying Maimonides all my life, and I'm still studying him now. First of all, the dogmas of Maimonides are very, very important. In fact, he put them in 13 principles, 13 dogmas, which we say usually in Yigdal Elohim Chai. But beside that, you have forgotten, with all due respect, that Habakkuk, Hanavi, the prophet Habakkuk, has put not only the whole Torah in 13, but in 3. O man, have you been told what the Almighty God wants from you? Except to do chesed, mishpat, tzedakah, to do kindness, justice, and righteousness. You remember that pasuk? So the Talmud says clearly that the whole Torah is based on 3 dogmas. So don't put your anger on Maimonides, put it on the prophet Habakkuk. But you seem also to forget, with all due respect, that the dogmas have in fact saved many, many people up to the present day, so that the tradition carries on and on and on. I can carry on more, but I think it's enough.
Friends, before I respond to my dear colleague Gagam Toledano, I tell you a little story. When I learned in Gateshead Yeshiva in England, which is an ultra-Orthodox Talmudic college, a friend of mine came to see me and asked me if he could see the Beit Midrash, where all the young men, few hundred of them, were learning Talmud. And I said to him, with pleasure. I gave him a yarmulke, a kippah, and he put it on his head, and I took him in without any introduction. The fellow thought that he was fainting. If you walk into a library in a university, there's one rule: silence. If you walk into a yeshiva, you can't imagine the noise of people shouting to each other in the middle of a Talmudic debate. People walking around left and right, arguing with their rabbis as if they are their own colleagues. This is typically the yeshiva world with all its problems and all its beauty. This young man turns to me and says to me, Nathan, as he calls me, what is this? This is a revolution against the Queen of England? This was in England. So I said, no, what we are discussing over here is what God actually said on the top of Mount Sinai. And then he looked to me with big eyes and said, you still don't know? And this, my friends, is exactly the point I'm trying to make. Within the Jewish tradition, everything is up to debate. I agree with Gagam Toledano that there are certain beliefs, but the belief is not a dogma. These are two totally different issues, and there's no time now to explain that in great lengths. Sure, the Jewish tradition believes in certain things. I believe in certain things. But how to formulate them, to know exactly what they say, to dogmatize them into a box is something. The first person who really did that was Saadia Gaon, who was a little before Rambam, but Maimonides, as the ultimate authority, was the one who fixed the 13. So while I agree, I also disagree with the Gagam, because there's a difference between a believing statement and putting something in a box and saying there's no discussion possible of what that means. No, within the Jewish tradition, we have been speaking about everything and anything. There is a Hasidic famous thinker, Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Rimanov, an outstanding thinker, who writes in his works that when the people of Israel stood at Mount Sinai, they only heard one thing. When God was going to give the 10 Commandments and the rest of the Torah. What does he say, did he hear? And this is an orthodox opinion within Hasidic Judaism. He said the only thing which they heard was the Aleph, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, of the word Anochi, I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. Now, my dear friends, think a moment about it. There is no way how to pronounce an Aleph. This is the only letter you can't pronounce. So what was the man saying? They were not listening or not hearing anything at all, and then throws in an unbelievable thing, that what they heard was from within their hearts. It is that what became part of what we call the Torah, and this is an orthodox view which nobody objects against. You can disagree with it, but it is not outside the Jewish tradition to make such a statement. My point is not a halachic issue whether or not we are able halachically to remove the ban. Probably it is right that we can't do that. I'm speaking about a symbolic issue. The symbolism is enormously important. Young people, and I have a lot of experience, don't want to touch the Jewish tradition after they have compared it to Khomeini, to the Catholic Church, to the Galileo situation, and I want to stop that and say, don't compare these cases with the case of the Jewish tradition. And therefore, while I understand that in the 17th century there may have been a need to put a cherem on Spinoza for political reasons, or that the rabbis were small-minded and did it for religious reasons, but the point which I'm making is this is not what the Jewish tradition is all about. There is freedom of thought. You can disagree. We can say to Spinoza, we don't agree with you. In the time it was needed. Now, when we make an impression that we still stand by the ban, it makes the impression on the world that we are still as dogmatic as we were a few hundred years ago, and that is what I want to prevent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. When you're having fun, time flies, and it's already 6, and I've been told to make a kind of sudden death, but I would like to ask Professor Jonathan Israel for his final verdict. It was your opinion that it would not be up to the Orthodox community to lift a ban on Spinoza, but to that kind of Judaism that has responded most to the Enlightenment. And maybe you can elaborate on that in 2 seconds that we do not have, but I grant them to you anyway, as a kind of final roundup for this session.
All I can say by way of a final rounder is that I admire immensely all the contributions. When I was listening to each of the speakers, I was completely persuaded at that moment. And therefore, I think all were learned, all were eloquent, and all were convincing. So all I can do is fall back on my original position and say I find both positions equally justified, and it depends whether you want to be a man of tradition or woman of tradition, or want to be a man or woman of Reform Judaism. And there are simply two perspectives on this, which ultimately I think can't be reconciled.
Are you saying then that religion will always tolerate but a limited amount of freedom of speech unless it has been enlightened? Is that what you say?
I think there doesn't have to be a collision between religion and even the most radical form of enlightenment, but usually there has been. And so both those two facts have to be taken into account. There doesn't have to be, but usually there has been. And if tradition is going to prevail and orthodoxy in your way of viewing the world, I don't think you can escape from that historical reality.
Yeah. Final question. Why is Spinoza so fascinating? Why? What explains the iconicity of the case Spinoza? Why not Moses Mendelssohn? Why not Hannah Arendt? Why Spinoza? Yes, please. Go ahead.
Well, 2 reasons, I think. The first one is that Spinoza is connected to the Dutch Republic, and I think that the Dutch now gradually see that there was something before the monarchy and all that it brings with it. That's the first reason. But the second one, and there I repeat what the topic I addressed before. He was perhaps the first one, and I think that Jonathan Israel very well expressed that. He was a defender of the radical Enlightenment. And I think there is a widespread feeling nowadays all over the world that the Enlightenment, in a certain sense, is under pressure, and that freedom of thought, freedom of expression is really under pressure. And then you are in need of a figure who defended so well freedom of expression as he did, in combination with moral autonomy.
Can I add to that the other thing is he got it right.
He got it right.
He got everything right.
Yes, sir.
We live in a secular world, and hence everyone is happy with Spinoza, because unfortunately orthodoxy is going down and down, and so the people are very happy to hear that there is no God, there is nothing, whatever, and that's exactly why it's popular.
Well, on this happy note, I am afraid I have to close this session, but I will not do that unless or until after I have expressed very heartfelt thanks on behalf of all of us to the experts here surrounding me at the table, to everybody who made it possible for the band to be physically present in this, well, this holy hall of a schuilkerk, which the Rode Hoed basically is. And I can all send you home with a very, very happy thought. Dr. Lopes Cardozo has already mentioned the Galileo case. In the year 1992, Pope John Paul II rehabilitated Galileo Galilei publicly, saying that the Inquisition had been very honest about it, but also very wrong about persecuting Galileo Galilei. The committee that actually established that the Inquisition had been wrong had finished its report in 1979. So it took the Vatican 13 years to step from the committee, from the report saying rehabilitate Galileo Galilei to actually rehabilitating. I think it's only 4 years since Ronit Palash addressed the Mahamat saying maybe we should do something out the ban. We have another 9 years to go to see if it will work. Thank you very much.
I thought there was meant to be an audience question and answer.
No, there's no time.